Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Minds Without Borders. This podcast is an endeavor of friends who found each other mostly in high schools and others through their families. So we have ventured out in this podcast universe to find like minded folks who might enjoy listening or engaging in conversations similar to ours. So, one thing I want to say is that if you have not had a chance to listen to our previous episodes, I highly recommend listening to them. So far, we have produced two episodes, and without my biases, right, my biases aside, I think we have done an amazing job. So, and if you have any thoughts or comments, we would love to hear them. You could comment on the videos, or you could message us through our social media platforms. We are available on all the popular platforms. But without wasting any more time, I would like to introduce our gang for today. Guys, please say hi as I call out your name. So, in today's episode, we have Subin from Cali
Hey guys.
and Manish from Colorado.
Hi guys.
Thank you. And I'll be your host for today. And my name is Umit, and I'm also from Colorado. So, so as I was prepping for this topic for today, I was looking into one particular topic, which is the work, right? The work culture in the U.S. And as I was thinking about the work, I started looking for some data, and for some reason, that's how my mind works. So what I found out was that an average person in the United States, they work around 1,700 hours. So exact was like 1,757 hours per year, and that translates to about like a quarter of each year. And then each person spends about a third of their life just working, right? So we spend a significant part of our life at work. So granted that, we don't spend it all at one job, and we move across position, we change companies or organizations. uh, but I feel like it is important, right, to discuss how valued we feel at work and how much we feel seen and heard at work. And I think that we have a diverse set of group here, who are in different field, that will add sort of a variety to this conversation. So, um, and one thing I want to add further to that is that, being an immigrant not from the U.S. sort of adds a layer where we navigate a whole different sets of challenges, right? So that's what I want to talk about and sort of peel in today's conversation. So, where I would like to start off our conversation is to talk a little bit about our experience, right? Like with our first job in our career. Now, we've been working in our field for a while. And I'm not talking about those odd jobs we picked up during our college days, but this is like, when you're done with your degree, right? Like what you went to school for, like where you felt like, oh, like this is, like I have arrived. So I just
Mhm.
wanted to pick up there, right? Like how did that first job influence your perspective, right, on work, and also like towards like professional growth, and how did you feel about that? So let's start there.
Sure, I can start. I'd like to believe I have an interesting story, like everybody does, I think. So I don't really know where I can start in terms of my first job because after I got out of college, I did start my first job. But the most, a really important aspect of that was before I started my first official full time job, I had two really, really good and in some ways long internships. So for those of you who may not know, I'm in the computer science. I'm from a computer science background. I've been a nerd, a geek, a loser, whatever you want to call me, since I was about 14, 15, 16. So yeah, so throughout my teenage years, I delved in, a little bit of programming here and there, some animation and things like that. But right before I graduated, my third year of college, I got a first I got a 3 month internship building, web applications in a company in Minnesota, actually, Minneapolis. And then after I got out of that 3 month internship, which I can talk in detail about later if needed, um, I actually worked part time for a year and a half in a very very unique internship program where our university worked with a really large company in Minneapolis called Thomson Reuters. And there was a
Mhm.
middleman kind of company called Maverick Software Consulting, which would hire students to work for Thomson. So I was one of the lucky first 10 students who got to do this year and a half internship. We had our own office right outside of our college. We would walk to our internship, our workplace, and it had a very, very flexible schedule. We could work in between our classes. So sometimes I would go to work at 11 a.m. after my two of my classes, work there for a couple of hours, have lunch, play hacky sack with my college friends, all computer science. All of us nerds talk about video games. Then go back to class for a couple of hours, then come back, and so that way I completed 20 hours a week. And then in the summertime they allowed us to work 40 hours a week. So that was a really good experience for
Mhm.
me. It was real world applications. We were writing tests, we were building applications, writing code. But the most important thing was it was not just writing very very basic level one, level two applications as we do for college, but it was actually looking at debugging, writing real application, real world applications. So that was really good experience for me. And then from then on, I did start my full time job at a company called Thomson Reuters, as I mentioned earlier, in Minneapolis. And so by the time I had my first job, I already had two other jobs in the real world. So that really
Hmm.
helped me understand, not just understand the technicalities and the experience required to work in a full time software development industry, but more in terms of communication. Right, I'm a
Hmm.
Mhm.
big believer in communication, and by the time I had gotten my first job, I had already built a rapport with my coworkers in Thompson, and so my internship was with Thompson, and then I went ahead and joined a different team, but within Thompson. So I had built up a year and a half, almost 2 years of having worked with professional people, being in meetings, just listening in
Hmm.
meetings, writing notes, and all of the
Yeah.
professional things that we learn on day one in our
Hmm.
job. But I felt like I had an
Yeah.
Mhm.
advantage due to those internships. That being said, I was horrible, I'm sure, in my first job still. I was very nervous most of the time. Sometimes I still wasn't used to the full 8 hour workday. So this is a
Hmm.
story that my college friends will attest to. I would fall asleep in meetings, not fully fall asleep, but I definitely had those meetings in those days when I was dozing off in the meetings, and I learned the hard way. It wasn't too hard, but I did get made fun of by my coworkers, even my boss at one point saying, "You must be, what are you doing at night that you're falling asleep here?" So there were some challenging interesting times. But yeah, that was my first experience. Obviously I can talk about a lot about what happened during my first job, but I feel very grateful that by the time I landed my first job, I already had a lot of experience, a lot of experience working with professional people, and also a lot of experience of actually having done real world work. How about you, Manish?
Yeah, I have a slightly different story because I finished my undergrad. I think both of us finished our undergrad around 2008 during the recession time, and I wasn't like lucky enough to get a job around that time. So I had to go through my masters, and then after masters, struggle to look for a job. And I was at a point where it was like a make or break situation for me, where I was, if I'm not able to find a job after my masters, I was at a point of contemplating whether I should go back to Nepal. So it
Hmm.
was kind of like all or nothing for me. And luckily I got a job at a boutique a management consulting slash data consulting company, where I got a wide varieties of exposure to both the data, the technological aspect, as well as the business consulting and the management aspect. And it ended up working out really well for me because I had done my undergrad in a business administration, and had done my master's on management information system and database technologies. So it was a good blend for me where I could use my past experience from undergrad as well as the data, wrangling with data at that role. And this job turned out to be really good because at that time I was kind of looking for like a mentor of
Mm.
all my life. I was initially looking uh, through my parents for that mentorship, but somehow, somewhere, never really got that. But at that job, and I'm really still close with my ex bosses, and we interact every now and then. And they were like the true mentors, and they really helped me, not only be good from the work aspect, but from the other aspects of life. And we really had like a good bond because we started as a team of 4 or 5 people. I was like a fourth or the fifth intern slash the full-time employee, and we grew that team to like 20, like a class consultants, and we're able to get acquired by a larger company in about like 5 or 6 years time. So we were able to build the company from ground up, and have that brotherhood as well as the sisterhood aspect of teamwork. So it was a really good, experience for me.
No, I think that's great, right? Like all of us have similar stories, I believe, where we are starting off, whether it's an internship or just kind of learning on the job. And that's one aspect, right? Like where we have to kind of figure stuff out. And I had a similar trajectory too. So for me, um, all my life, even till today, my work has been limited to colleges and universities, right? I did my PhD, and after that, I started teaching. So I make a joke that if I were not if if for some reason universities stop existing in this world, I don't know what else I will do because I don't have any other skill set to to really do anything else in this world. uh, but Subin, you touched up on one of the important thing that I think a lot of us have started learning on the job, and that's this idea around communication, right? Like
Mhm.
those are the things that are really not taught in school, right? In classroom, right? We are often taught like, okay, this is it, right? Like whether it's computer science or hard sciences or social sciences, like we have always focused on the curriculum, and it's like this. Communication, I feel like, as I am so getting into my field, I feel like communication is really key, not just to communicate your ideas but also to get folks on board with your ideas, right? Get on the same team. So that's something that I'm interested to hear, right? And I think it would be of value to our listeners and viewers, right, to kind of hear both of your take on that communication piece, right, in your workplace. Like was there a sort of a gap that you had to kind of jump over or learn, in maintaining that sort of professional relationship but also professional growth? So I would be curious to hear something along those lines.
Yeah, definitely. So during my consulting experience, I had like a really good like role models, Girish, Derek, Garrett, and Curtis. They were like executives from telecommunication industry on with finance strategy and a computer science background. So from that, like from the communication aspect, they really helped me and other interns who started at the company kind of go through like what we were trying to solve, because we were in a consulting business, so it was all about solving problems. And
Hmm.
one of the framework that they introduced to every one of us, and because we had to do like all kinds of work, right? We had to sometimes build the slide work, sometimes do the data analysis, sometimes do like a BI reporting. So the framework that they kind of honed on was like for any problem or any communication, it was situation complication resolution. So what is the problem, what is the situation, what is the complication, and what is the resolution, right? So we use that framework when we were communicating with a client, or like either verbally or through written, right? And that is the framework that initially it took me a little time to get to understand, because I was like fresh off doing masters, not with the enough professional experience. But and also like I didn't have like a full like out view of like what we were trying to do, so it was fresh off the boat. And trying to understand like how to deliver that communication style. So we really use that framework not just on the slideware but from our communication standpoint. And I've been using the similar aspect or the similar framework whenever I'm communicating, even now, because that really hit me like,
Mm-hmm.
that was like really 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 good framework. Subin, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts all the time. But yeah, as I mentioned, communication is something that I bring up pretty much all the time. Um, I believe it's the number one human trait that we all need to be good
Mm-hmm.
about. I talk about and I learned about not just verbal communication. There's a lot of non-verbal communication as well.
Mhm,
Um,
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I learned early in my career is, especially at least in our technical field, because we're all nerds. Really, communication. You communicate a lot through just your work. So in the beginning, in the
mhm,
early parts of my career, I've always been this way. I'm vocal, for good or bad. I speak my mind for good or bad, and at least in my industry, that's supported, at least in the beginning. That's encouraged. So
mhm.
I was encouraged a lot to continue to speak my mind. Continue. I ask a lot of questions. That's probably, uh, sometimes it becomes. My
Yeah.
son is starting to ask a lot of questions, and it can become
Mm-hmm.
quite. Quite difficult to answer all those questions. But as an adult, even as an adult, my dad used to say, actually, as a kid, I asked a lot of questions. I always used to ask why this, why that. So that was a built-in feature in me. So I used to ask a lot of questions, and I actually, very funny story, that got an award, like a small, rolling award, we called it, that every 2 weeks, or every month, a small trophy, didn't have a monetary value, didn't have any value other than, hey, you're doing a good job, that kind of award. I got awarded an award in my second or third month just because I was asking questions. So that was the kind of
Mm-hmm.
encouragement that I got for just being curious, just asking questions. But obviously, that can only take you so far. So in the beginning,
Yeah.
as an engineer, your work
Mhm.
speaks for you, but eventually, you want to be able to ask not just questions, but ask the right questions, ask them at the right
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
time, ask them,
Mhm.
ask the important questions, and then even more so as you go on, it becomes important to be able to communicate your ideas, communicate your uh, that can come into fruition. So jumping really quickly on that aspect, throughout the years, as I learned about communication and being better at communicating, I actually joined. Some of you may know about this, but I actually joined
Yeah.
Toastmasters. Right, now
Mm-hmm.
Toastmasters, unknown to most of the people. It sounds like it's just something that you do to toast or cheers in a party, but that's not what it is, right? Toastmasters is this global organization where you learn how to speak properly, communicate your ideas, and even more so to do so in public. So um,
Mm-hmm.
after about, I don't know, 5 or 8 years in my career, I joined a company a Toastmasters club that was internal to our company, where we would practice speaking in front of people. Every 2 weeks, you had to either speak impromptu on ideas that or topics that people came up with, or give speeches. One of the most important things that you learn during in Toastmasters is the removal of what we call filler words, like I just did right now,
Mhm.
ahs, and
Mm-hmm.
many other words that we may use. So I still remember on my first introduction speech, they literally have a counter for how many ums and ahs you spoke. So, I went through to these meetings. The first speaker comes in, oh, you had five ums and three ahs, and the other person comes in, oh, you had 10 ums and three ahs. And by my third meeting, I spoke, and the counter counted me. I had like 35 ums and 42 ahs, or something along those lines, right? It was crazy high.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, um, you learn to just practice being not using filler words, but just being quiet, giving yourself some
Mm-hmm.
time, pausing, and that's just the beginning. Over time you learn about making eye contact with an audience, or you know, uh,
Mhm.
I'm not able to come up with all the other things that I learned at that point because obviously I'm nervous right now. But yeah, so the Toastmasters, I still encourage people to join some Toastmasters or something like that, where you get to freely practice communicating, speaking,
Mm-hmm.
making a lot of mistakes, and nobody's there to
Yeah.
judge you. Everybody's there to help you. Everybody's there to tell you. Even when I was doing my worst speeches, everybody was there to tell me you did a great job. And
Mm-hmm.
and that was not just people being nice. It's because I realized that everybody has weaknesses and everybody has strength, and people would focus
Mhm.
on, we ourselves focus on our weaknesses, but other people, they see our strength. So over time you learn
Yeah.
to uh, grab onto your strengths and improve on our weaknesses, so uh, I still have a lot to improve in terms of communication, but uh, joining a club like Toastmasters and practicing giving speeches and one-on-one communication with my managers over time in a
Mm-hmm.
professional environment really helped me a lot. And I think I'm at least 2% better than what I was 20 years ago. I'd like to believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you are, although I did not know you 20 years ago. So, right. So I don't have a baseline on that. But so yeah, no, I think that's a great point, right? Like communicating, talking to people, that is one thing. But I think there's also this, what I like to call like a hidden curriculum, right, in your career. It's like not just communicating, but networking in other ways. Like it could be like showing up at a happy hour, right,
Yeah,
after
for
office,
sure.
or right, like, or showing up in a lunch meeting or something like that. And I started in the opposite spectrum of the whole thing because I, for the longest time, felt that if your work speaks volume, then you don't have to worry about other things, right? I don't know where I got that idea. So I always was a firm believer. Like I should do this, this, this. I should excel in my courses or whatever, right? And I should be able to get the job. And as I started looking out for the jobs and stuff like that, I slowly started realizing that there is this whole another dynamic, right? To get into your career is like you should maintain that professional relationship. And I think over time, as I have moved across position, like I've gained those valuable insights that I've learned on my own, right? And like I said, it could be as simple as sending out emails like to check up on your coworkers, right, saying hey, like, how are you doing, but also to maintain that relationship, right? And what Manish was touching up on earlier that I liked was that he still has those connection with his mentor and has that sort of frame of reference, right, in his career that he could go back and talk. And I think that is so key, right? Like if you want to progress forward in your career, in my opinion, that you need to have those what do we want to call it, the mentors, or I would like to call like frame of reference, right? uh, so but those things don't come easily, right, for us, because there is that barrier, I feel like, for us who did not grow up here, right? So I think that's one thing that I want to discuss a little bit further, is like where there's some challenges there, right, to make that jump. To It could be, a simple thing like a joke, right, that you might not get because you're not from here. And it would be the same thing if you have folks from here coming to Nepal and working, and there are some cracks joke, like they would not understand, right? So things like that, like I think those add value, but also it's difficult for us because we don't grew up here. Like we did not grow up here. So how was that? Like, were there any issues or anything like that for you all, that I think would be valuable for our listeners as well, I think.
Coming from the consulting background, it was like really interesting for me because it was I got like I get to see like getting making new connection, meeting
Hmm.
new people, and one of the things at our company was we got new projects based on our relationships, or like from the past
Mm.
relations, helping a friend. It all
Yeah.
started with helping a friend, and then from a friend it came work, then growing your network. So it was all about increasing your network, getting making new connections. So like when I initially started, it was all new for me.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look back now, I was like pretty shy guy, not speaking much.
Yeah.
But over time, like during meetings, I just open up. And
Mm-hmm.
like Subin brought like really good point about asking questions.
Yeah.
And normally I was pretty shy, but when it comes to like work, I was always asking questions. And sometimes even my managers and mentors, they were like, oh, out of the blue, like I was asking all these intriguing questions, and they really liked it. And
Mm-hmm.
that really helped me open up to them. And all my life I was looking for that kind of like a setting where I could be myself, where I could openly say whatever I was thinking. And I
Yeah.
found that with that group of people,
Mm-hmm.
uh, during like my 6 or 7 years when we were working together.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like really good group of setting. And uh, like getting acquainted with other people, and making that making that connections, and and talking about all these different work wise as well as the other aspects of life. So
Yeah.
that really over time helped me
Uh-huh.
get into acquainted with that culture. Initially it was very hard, but as
Mm-hmm.
you gradually open up, you kind of knew, and kind of learn how to build that connections. And one thing that I've realized is like over time, that those connections have really helped me.
Yeah.
And in this last 15 or 15 years of working, all of my new gigs or new jobs has been through my connections. And
Mm.
one of the things that I've learned is like I always try to build that personal relationship with whoever I'm working with, whether it's
Yeah.
junior, senior. And it could be simple thing like talking about like football or soccer or music. And I just try to build the relationship like that, whether with the intern, or just try to get to know them, because work needs to be fun, right? And if you're not like, if you don't have that human element, because we're spending like 8 or 9 hours of our day with those people, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we got to know them, we got to understand their emotions. So, and that's something that I really value, and
Mm-hmm.
I try to get as much as possible, communicate
Yeah.
with that person at that level, just not from the work level, or but at that personal level. And I think that kind of makes you uh, successful over time.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. That's a really, really good point. I was, in terms of talking about the human element, right? Um, I had so many thoughts as Manish was talking about that, but talking about uh, connecting with people at that human level. A couple of
Mm-hmm.
examples I have are, I have never, for again, for good or bad, I've never been shy about looking confused, or
Yeah,
if somebody tells me a joke, so let's go back to the beginning. In terms of communication, even as a kid, let's say when I was ninth grade, 10th grade, 14, 15 years old, I knew that I would be moving out of Nepal and going to either Australia, England, or United States of America. And so I used to practice my English. And one of the things that I talked to a lot of people about, and I'm sure you guys went through this as well, is when we're first learning to communicate in English, English as a second language people, we first think in our native language in our head and then translate
Mm-hmm.
that into English as we speak. But obviously, as we get older, as we get more fluent, that goes away and we're able to communicate or think in the language that we're trying to speak in this case, English.
Yeah.
So as a kid, I was practicing to do that a lot. But even, and I was very much interested in the American culture and the Western culture. So, you know, when I started making friends in the United States, I used to get between 50 to 80% of their references, and I
Mm-hmm.
was sometimes impressed myself that I would get it. But the 20% or so, or maybe more of the time that I didn't get it, I would just simply ask, sorry, I don't know what that
Yeah.
means. And one thing that I
Mhm.
do love about Americans, or at least Americans that I've met, and not just Americans, but people who are open-minded, they never
Hmm.
make fun of you for not understanding or not getting the joke,
Yeah.
because America is a country of subcultures. There are so many subcultures,
Yep.
Mhm.
and there's, even as an American, there could be so many things that you may not be aware about. So I would always get very good feedback when I asked, "Hey, I don't know what that means. Can you explain that to me?" And they would happily explain the joke to me. On the flip side, what I also did was, I would, you know for good or bad, I look brown, people know that maybe I have an accent, I'm not from here, so there's no hiding in terms of, hey, I'm not, born American.
Mhm.
So I would always introduce my culture into the conversations as well. So um, one phrase, Nepali phrase, that I use a lot, pretty much in every job I have had, and you guys can do that too, is this Nepali phrase that we have, which is "Hati sirio puchar argyo," right? For Americans, for
Yeah.
English speaking people, what that means is, it literally translates to, the elephant is in, but the tail is stuck. So, and this phrase gets a lot of laugh, because it totally doesn't make sense in English, but it totally makes sense what you're trying to say, when you're trying to say, I've done the majority of the work, but the little bit of work
Mhm.
that's left is still left.
Hmm.
So I use that a lot. I just say, the elephant is in, but the tail is stuck, and you always get a laughter out of people. So I always try to incorporate my culture, what I know.
Hmm.
Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be Nepali culture. It's something that I might have read
Yeah.
into the conversation,
Mhm.
and just tying that back into the human element. And that's why I really liked it. So whether you're communicating in in terms of computers, or whatever the topic it may be, if you connect to a person at a human level, everything else
Yeah.
becomes much more smooth. And
Hmm.
it just becomes very natural, because at least in the technical world, technology world, computer world, a lot of computer concepts are explained in real world terms, right? So there's this concept of object oriented programming, and you always teach
Mhm.
people in terms of, a car is a vehicle has tires, and the car has tires, etc. This is not going to make sense to people who don't know computers, but it doesn't matter. But the point I'm trying to make is that, um, when you talk in the human element, rather than
Hmm.
uh, a man to woman, or a computer person to non-computer person, or American to Nepali person, then a lot of things can get lost in translation. But when you do talk to people in a human element, even if you may have an accent, even if you may say things like "Hati churi putar arko," elephant is in, tail is stuck, people get a laugh out of that, and you're instantly
Hmm.
bonded. So I also truly believe in connecting with people as a human being, and not as a white person, or black person, or American, or whatever
Yep.
it may
Yeah.
be. So
Yeah.
but I did want to question Umit as well, because you've been asking the
Yeah.
questions. We
Yeah.
live in a much slightly more, let's say, different world, where the relationship is much more, uh, I don't want to say equal, but
Like.
level playing. Whereas you being a professor before you were a student, you have to communicate in a slightly different manner. You have to show authority. You know, in my job as a manager, yeah, at times I do have to
Hmm.
show authority, but even then, I'm still speaking much more like I'm speaking to a colleague. Whereas you
Mhm.
have to show authority. You have to say, no, I'm not going to take this, right? So going from not being able to communicate your ideas properly to talking to people as colleagues, as friends, is one step. But then there's a next step in terms of stamping your authority and telling people you have to do as I say. How have you found that aspect of the next step of, next step of communicating your ideas or stamping your authority?
So that's a really good question. Thank you. The way I have approached that is kind of use my experience, right, as a student, and how I connected with my professors at that time. And obviously there were folks that I connected with more than others, and I think that's how I have approached this, right? So it could be, or it would be like, I connected more with my professors who were pretty informal with me, we don't have to call them like Dr. So and so. So one thing I do with my student is that I just show up on the first day and I say, hey, like, my name is Umit Shrestha, right? And you can call me Umit. And that's one thing that I've seen. Uh, it's a little bit different because I know some of my colleagues, like, they want to be addressed as Dr. So so, right? And I show up like, oh, like, I don't have to be called Dr. Shrestha or Dr. Umit. You can just call me Umit. So now I try to take that route because I feel like the more informal environment we create, I think that becomes easier for students. And I am in a field which is very heavy on discussion, right? So I teach public health courses. So I cannot just show up to class, and I teach graduate level students. So I cannot just show up to class and just start lecturing, right? There needs to be an element of discussion, there needs to be an element of seminar. So we need to have a place where students are comfortable sharing, right? So we do certain activities throughout the class, throughout the semester, where they feel, right, they can speak their mind. Because I feel like if you're not in that space, then I don't think learning can happen, right? So I am very intentional about that, in maintaining that informal scenario. Now, obviously, if the students are not doing what I'm asking them to do, I have no, I don't feel otherwise just calling them out and say, hey, like, this needs to be done, right? So it is a fine line of of maintaining that relationship where it is sort of informal, where they can feel like they can speak their mind, but they also know that they have to submit their assignments on time. There is a level of evaluation that's going to happen, and I'm pretty much open with them and say, hey, like, I understand there is a power dynamic between you and I, but I want to create a space where you feel like you are heard, but also understand that there is a level of boundary here that we cannot cross. So that's how I uh, approach that. And one thing I'll say before I forget is to what Manish was referring, and you touched up on also, is asking questions, because that's so important, right? Because
Hmm.
that makes you, the person, uh, feel like they're being listened to, right? And when I say it, when Manish said that, I automatically went back to my professor mode, because I
Hmm.
could be lecturing left and right, and always I'm thinking, like, are my students grasping this, right? Are they getting this? And I always be like, hey, like, do you have any thoughts or comments? And now what I've done is, before the end of the class, I sometimes spontaneously go like, okay, somebody ask me a question, right? Somebody come on, like, ask me a question so that I can answer. And there's always something there, right? The students are like, oh, like, by the way, what do you think about this? Or I pull up what we call like a Google Jamboard, where students can ask questions anonymously and I answer those questions. So I think that is such a key aspect of building that relationship. Uh, Making people feel like they're being listened to, they're heard, they're seen. So asking question, it could be a very minimal thing from you, but it could
Hmm.
add a lot of value to that relationship. So I just wanted to signify.
That's such a great point because I was thinking about this. You know, uh, there's this stereotype that they show in movies and whatever, that whichever student, when a professor asks a question and goes whoop like
Mhm.
that and answers the question,
Yeah.
is a teacher's favorite. But
Yeah.
but from my experience, the easiest way to be a teacher's pet or be liked by a teacher is actually to ask teacher
Yep.
the teachers a question, right? Instead of
Yeah.
after a point the teacher is like, you don't know everything, so instead of being the
Hmm.
person coming up and knowing all the answers, I think if there's any student out there listening, if you want to be the teacher's pet and uh, get favors from the teacher, it's probably best to actually flip that around and ask, obviously not every 2 minutes ask a question or something, but definitely, every class that you go to, once a class, you should probably ask a question. And it doesn't have to be a complicated question. It doesn't have to be a simple question. It just has to be a genuinely curiosity based question. And that's what I
Mhm.
try to live
Yeah.
by. I don't ask questions just because it's the right thing to do, or it is the right thing to do, but it's the wrong thing
Yeah.
to do if you're doing it just because it's the right thing to do. You want to do it
Yeah.
because you're genuinely curious about something. And if you don't have any questions, great. But if you do have a question, whether it's asking in front of people, asking it privately, uh, I genuinely implore people to ask questions. And I say the same thing at my workplace. If there's somebody who I'm mentoring, is don't be afraid to ask questions. People teachers say this all the time, but nobody heeds that advice. But
Mhm.
I by nature, for good or bad, I just ask way too many questions. um
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
For me, like from work, like we just had to ask question because we were going to a brand new setting, new environment, new company, trying to get some project work, and you just have to ask question whether understand the environment or the business problem that they're trying to solve or about the data, right? So asking question is very critical. But while you guys were talking, there was another subject that I wanted to talk about because like when I was having like a flashback towards my like earlier side of my career, and I was thinking like how I had grown and what was some of the weak points for me. And at the beginning of my career, like the emotional intelligence, I was
Uh,
really bad at it. Like not, I was really really bad at it, and because I wasn't aware of that, like how the emotional intelligence side of like your coworkers or your day to day interaction, and over time I've developed. But I just wanted to ask, like, to you guys, how have you guys evolved the emotional intelligence aspect of work? Did it come naturally, or or did you guys like had to put in effort to grow gradually over time?
How would you I guess I would first ask, I think it's a big
Like
phrase. Yeah,
emotional
what yeah,
intelligence,
what how would you say,
like
what
emotional
what is included in
like
emotional intelligence?
like emotional intelligence in the sense of like when you're interacting with your coworkers, or even the senior, right? Like just
mhm.
being aware of your surrounding, right? Because and also like sometimes you might say like some things like out of the blue, right? Like
Mhm.
that might not be like like politically correct, or like or or accurate within the work environment, right? So
Mhm.
like being aware of your surrounding, right? Because uh, from that aspect, like oh, I was trying to address that question.
Amit, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a comfort level there that needs to happen, right? So, if I know the person, and my supervisor, right, I think those things happen over time. Those things happen with trust, and obviously you learn from your your first job to your second job to your third job, right? So that's what I would say, is that you learn it over time. Now I don't have an example like on the top of my head that I can give out right now, but I think what you were referring to, Manish, I think it takes time, but also a level of trust, right? To be able to be open, right, and to say whatever you want to say. Because if I'm meeting you for the first time, then more than likely I'm going to be like very guarded. I'm not going to talk about left and right, um, and especially if you're at a job, then there is a level of expectation. So I think in my early career days, like I was very guarded, right? Oh, like, I can't say this, I can say that. And now I think I'm more attuned to my surroundings. I see where
Mhm.
folks are, what they are comfortable with, right? And it
Uh,
could be, I mean, you could figure things out, right, with folks like
yeah.
where they lean politically or socially. So, you kind of tiptoe that line, and you kind of get yourself in that position, where it's okay to say things like that. But I mean, obviously, if you're just starting off in a new job and you're meeting folks in the new time or for the first time, sorry, it could be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of myself as too emotional and not enough intelligent, right? So my emotional intelligence, I mean, it's all relative, right? I've been in, I'm as I've talked about before. I put myself in a, I make myself very vulnerable. I'm, very
Hmm.
open. One of the things I believe in is to let people open up. You have to open up yourself, right? So I let
Uh-huh.
myself be vulnerable. Obviously, politics is probably the last thing that you talk about because that's the most sensitive
Hmm.
topic, especially
Yeah.
these days. But outside of that,
Yeah.
I always make sure that I open up to people first, and I give
Mm-hmm.
myself wholly to them. That being said,
Mm-hmm.
Umit mentioned, whether that was in the beginning of my career or even now, when I first go into a new job, I am going to be a little more guarded. I am going to be a little more,
Mm-hmm.
um, just assessing the situation
Hmm.
Yeah.
before I open up. But that being said,
Uh-huh.
after I've created some kind of rapport, after I've created some kind of
Mm-hmm.
I've broken a few barriers, professional barriers, then I let myself open up and see where that takes me. Most of the time, I've felt even with people who I disagree with or people who may disagree with me, if I'm being genuine and
Mm-hmm.
honest and opening myself and letting and showing them my vulnerabilities, my weaknesses, they are much more willing to accept me as I am, and they will open up to me as well.
Uh-huh.
And on
Hmm.
top of that, I want to add, in terms of awareness, the topic that you brought up. You know, I've always believed in being aware of your surroundings, right? Awareness and
Uh-huh.
context. I always bring context is key to everything. Any community, you
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
can say whatever you want, uh, but it has to match or it has to align with the context of what is being talked about. So I practice, as you guys know, I practice meditation, and one of the kind of
Uh-huh.
meditations that I practice is mindfulness, which is basically being aware of your surroundings. It
Uh-huh.
starts very basic from the sound of the bird or the air blowing in your face, that kind of awareness, all the way to you know being very aware of a person's needs, even if it is a
Hmm.
stranger. Anything from when you're driving, if you see an old person crossing the road versus a kid crossing the road, or all of that is context and awareness. And I believe, obviously, that is key to a successful relationship, whether that be in professional environment or friendship or any other kind of
Mm-hmm.
relationship. So, yeah, awareness, context. Think about what is being talked about before you speak, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes we all say things that are completely random, but even then, maybe okay if everybody's just talking random, right? That's the context.
Hmm.
But if everybody
Yeah.
is very seriously talking about one thing, and then you just randomly insert some random joke, even if it is funny, it's not going to be funny in the moment
Hmm.
if it is not matching the context of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, and one thing that you said, Subin, like the acceptance, right, at workplace, I think that's also key to kind of think about as you are navigating the workplace, right? And
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I've started to be more aware of the place where I work or the organizations or the companies that I engage with is this topic around diversity and inclusivity, right? Because I believe, right, like we should be in a position or being in a position that we should create space for others. And I would be curious to hear, right, how does that look like in your field of work, right? For us in academia it looks very different, and I believe it looks very different. I'm just curious to hear how does that look in your field.
Yeah. I mean, in my field, like, diversity in what context, right? It's it's like we I interact at the human level, as
Hmm.
so it's a hard question, because when I'm working on a day-to-day basis, I'm working at the personal level, so I don't really think about diversity that much, or it doesn't really affect at all, because that that me being the only like a Nepalese or brown guy in the room, it doesn't really matter to me because we are there for a specific reason, right? We're trying to
Mm-hmm.
solve a specific problem, and so you're just bringing your thought process from that aspect. So I've never really thought about diversity, you know, too much when I'm working on a day-to-day basis. Or I mean, it hasn't ever occurred to me that, you know, I'm the only guy. Because
Mm-hmm.
like Subin was mentioning, like, uh and I 100% agree. I also never hesitate to speak my mind at work, like
Mm-hmm.
when it's related to like a critical, you know, like the business problem that we're trying to solve, you know, whether, you know, anything related to data. So I'm pretty vocal about it, and I try to put my mind, or put my statement across it. So from that aspects, you know, like diversity doesn't really matter. And I have like a work with like female colleagues, or like female clients, like when working with a day-to-day basis. So it doesn't really matter. It's all about like solving the problem, to me. Subin, what are your thoughts on
Yeah.
this?
So there's three things to say about that, right? So one, I should say, I'm in the IT field, so the IT field
Mm-hmm.
is quite diverse. Maybe not as
Hmm.
many women, but that is
Mm-hmm.
increasing. But in terms of, if you want to talk about diversity in terms of race or nationality, there's definitely a lot of diversity. Not in every workplace that I've worked at, but there's definitely a lot of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
But I should, I do want to say that diversity is important, but as Manish said, I think I personally believe in diversity of thought rather than diversity
Yeah,
of,
exactly.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
color or nationality. Because as you guys can attest to, I'm sure, I've met a lot of Nepali people who are very close-minded, and
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
so I could be in a group of full of Nepali people and feel like an outsider if they're
Yeah.
very close-minded, whereas I could feel like I'm part of a group if it's a bunch of white people, but they're very open-minded about things. So
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
for me, diversity of thought is more important than the labels that we put on humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
In
Uh-huh.
fact, in
Exactly.
fact, if while we're talking about diversity and color, I always use this line: nobody's white, nobody's black. We're all brown. We're all different shades of brown. That being said, the difference, the kind of the what makes a difference is not the color of our skin, but rather the culture that we've been raised in, we've grown up in.
Hmm.
And even then, there's a lot of diversity within culture. There's a lot of subcultures. Even even within my family, my dad, mom, myself, and my sister, we disagree on so many different things. Political
Mm-hmm.
or not, right? So. Uh, to me, I would much rather have somebody I disagree with, somebody who is close to me, in terms of thought. I would much rather have a group of people who, all of them, I want everybody to be open-minded but have differing thoughts, rather than being with like-minded people but they're all very close-minded.
Hmm.
So to me, whether you're a man or a woman, Asian or American, or white or black, again, dark brown or
Mm-hmm.
light brown, we should start saying, it's more important that we are open-minded and we have diverse thoughts. Diversity of thought is good, but the idea of
Uh-huh.
diversity in terms of just because you're brown, you're all gonna think the same. Just because you're a man,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that is
exactly.
actually not only not good. I think that's harmful, right? Because that puts us in silos. Whenever somebody sees me, immediately I'm brown, I'm short, I'm losing my hair, I'm married, I have a son. You know,
Mm-hmm.
which bucket am I in?
Yeah. Do you feel like there is some level of privilege that comes with, being educated here, right? In your instance, when you went through your internship, right? You did this, and you are into your workforce. You plugged into your workforce. Is there some level of privilege that you feel like, going into your job, that you feel like, oh, like, I can speak my mind, right? Because I've been in this space for a few years. How does that add uh, to that conversation?
Yeah, privilege is a strange thing, right? These days, in the political climate that we're in, there's white privilege and there's man privilege,
Mhm,
and yeah, we all have privileges. Even me
mhm,
coming here, I am a minority here, but let's not kid ourselves. We are middle class in Nepal. We had privilege
mhm.
in Nepal. There's a whole bunch of
Yep.
people in Nepal who could not be anywhere close to where I am today because my parents worked hard for me.
Mhm,
My parents weren't rich, but they provided all sorts of education, everything that they thought I needed to be where I am today. So I
mhm,
definitely have privilege. But then an American who was born here, who was raised here, also has privilege. So, but then there may be other people who don't have privilege. To me,
mhm,
the conversation of privilege leads directly to empathy. Whether I
okay.
have privilege or not, am I capable of being empathetic to another person who may or may not
Mhm,
have the same privileges as me? You
mhm.
know. Again, if we want to be a little more political here, there's a lot of talk about how white men have privilege, which may be true, but they don't have the kind of experience that I have. Is I have some advantages over them. I've traveled the world. I've seen
Mhm,
different things. I've eaten different kinds of food. A white man has privilege, but as soon as they start eating some spicy food, they start turning red. Is that does that mean I have brown privilege or spicy
mhm,
spicy food privilege? So to me, what we should, I think, be aware of is whether or not we do have privilege. I think most of us
mhm,
do. If you're successful, then there were some advantages that somebody, you gain some advantages without your own doing.
yeah,
Everybody, I think, has been helped by somebody else, whether that be a relative,
mhm,
a family member, friend, whoever it is. It's more important that you recognize that, and recognize that other people may also have privileges or not have privileges, and to work with them based on those advantages or disadvantages.
I mean, we're talking about privilege, having like having education in US. Are you
yeah,
counting that as a privilege? Because in my line of work, at my previous company, when I was working at Wipro, it was a
mhm,
global company, so we had teams all over the world. So it didn't really matter where you're from. What mattered was what you bring on the table. So we had folks who were working from India, were like super talented,
uh-huh,
uh, like uh, uh, like who were like really great like data engineers. So I was working with them, so it didn't really matter. What mattered was what you knew, like what technology you knew, and what you bring on the table when you're working on that specific project from the problem solving aspect. So I think the having that U.S. education, I think, has diluted. Maybe it was like having that U.S. education would put you on top of the line, but these days, I think it has definitely changed because you have people like who's the like Sundar Pichai, and like who's the CEO of Microsoft,
mhm,
Satya Nadella, right? Because
yeah,
they had their education in India, and I don't know if they did their higher education here, but having not having that higher education in US, it doesn't really matter. It's all about like uh, your experience and what you bring to the table, and the companies are global these days, right? So
mhm.
from that aspects, I mean, it does add value if you're trying to get a job here, but if the company is global, I don't think it brings like too much to the table, or it doesn't really matter.
So I feel like we're kind of going backwards, right? Like on the conversation we have had, and we talked about communication style. We talked about
Uh-huh.
how being here, and that communicating with folks, and those are the things, something we learned here in the US, right, through our time, whether in our college, with our conversation with friends, and that's what I was referring to when I was saying, right, there are a lot of things that, yes, like the degree. I'm not talking about your education, just a degree from the US versus other parts of the world. I think, yeah, right? Your skill set and everything is you could put them as equal. But does that other piece, right, that what I call the hidden curriculum, right? Does that give us an advantage, right? Does that, like, can that be counted as privilege, right? Because you are so, like, you can speak up, right, saying, oh, like, you can articulate yourself in English, you can ask questions, and these are some of the things that I think are promoted, right, in the US education system, more so than what I have experienced in Nepal. So that's what I was talking about, right? So if we were to come out and say,
Yeah,
like,
no,
right, like, if
but
on the
the
one
but
side, if you're saying yes, like, yeah, okay, like the communication matters, and then we're coming out and say, well, in the job place, it's everybody's equal, then I does that mean like we're kind of going backwards on that conversation? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
no, so uh like these days, like especially in IT, and IT can be like software engineering or data engineering, right? Like you have
Mm-hmm.
all these offshore companies, and yeah, I have like a couple of friends who worked in an offshore company in Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
The company had the U.S. office and branch office in Nepal, and they were doing working there in Nepal, and they got over here, on J1 visa or H1B, and
Mm-hmm.
now they're living and working there. So from that perspective, it didn't really matter, right? Because like they were basically working in Nepal as well as here, and I think the education system, maybe it's not at the same par, but like from the I'm speaking more on the context of IT, and Subin can attest, like it doesn't really matter these days whether you are studying here in the US or you're studying in Nepal or India, because you're doing the similar kind of work. So I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there is definitely the aspect of like communication and emotional intelligence that might come, but that's something that you can grow at the workplace. And especially with all these companies that have offices here in US as well as in India or rest of the world, you it's kind of like a one connected environment, and these companies kind of groom you or help you be successful. So I don't think it really matters these days, and I might be wrong.
So I I just want, I think, alter this doesn't matter phrase a little bit. I think it does matter. It's just that it's not the only thing that matters, right? So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's,
exactly.
yeah, I think that's what it is. Of course, as I mentioned, even the folks that you're talking about, who, I've co-workers in India, and I've worked with people in Ukraine and Argentina, and etc.
Hmm.
The folks that I work with, they're privileged, more privileged than other folks in Argentina. And the folks that you
Mm-hmm.
work with,
Yeah.
people in India, are more privileged than other folks. But that's the nature of humanity, throughout
Hmm.
the human history. Some people are born rich, some people are born poor, some people have privileges and others don't. But does that matter? Sure. If I didn't have, my parents didn't work hard, and my parents didn't work,
Mm-hmm.
really hard, and raise me the way I am, which caused me to have privilege, then I wouldn't be here. Of course, it does
Yeah.
matter, but I think
Yeah.
it's less about uh, just focusing on just privilege. Of course, we should acknowledge privilege. That's what I
Mm-hmm.
keep
Yeah.
going back to. We should acknowledge the
Uh-huh.
privilege that we have. If I talk to another person who has more privilege, who's had more privilege than me, they should acknowledge that privilege that they have. But I shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
use my lack of privilege compared to them as a crutch. And I don't mean to say that just be, you can use it as a. It doesn't always. It's not. Some people will say, "Oh, don't play the victim," right? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not as easy as that, because
Yeah.
I may be emotionally, personally, a strong person who is able to overcome my lack of privilege, but not
Mm-hmm.
everybody can. So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
uh, and obviously it applies vice versa too. Somebody could have
Mm-hmm.
white privilege or any other kind of privilege and thus have succeeded, but just because they
Mm-hmm.
have the privilege doesn't guarantee them the success. So
Mm-hmm.
we should acknowledge privilege, just like we should acknowledge everything else as part of our human history, but we shouldn't just, what's the word?
Fixate.
Yeah, fixate, exactly. We
Yeah,
shouldn't
fix
just
it.
fixate on just
Mm-hmm.
that aspect, to say that, oh, you're successful because you've had male privilege
Hmm.
or Asian
Mm-hmm.
privilege, or
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a valid point, right? I think there is privilege with everyone. And one thing in my career that I've kind of moved on to is, and this is something that one of my students said, um, I we talked about privilege in our class, and one thing one of my students said was that don't just leave space, create space, right? And I think I firmly believe in that, right? Is that I value diversity, and I think organizations who value diversity do well, right? And that's something that's been on my mind quite some time now, right? How do I create space for folks who look like me, right, and who have my background, right? And that's something that is of importance for me. So one thing that I've been thinking about is understanding how other fields, right, uh, operate, and how much is of representation, right, of who you are matters in your work, right? And this could be as simple as recognizing the holidays, right? Obviously, a lot of us who work here, we are Hindus, from Nepal, and we have Dasai Tihar, but we don't
Hmm.
get day off, right? Or we don't get to celebrate like we would do in Nepal. But just recognizing those things, right? Saying, oh, like, today is my festival. I could either take a time off or something like that, right? Would be something to think about, maybe, or have that thought process. So I'm curious to hear about that too, right? Like, how much does that representation, right, in your line of work matter, right? Or I don't want to say do you care about it, because obviously you do, but how does that come about, right? Or should we be focusing on that?
Go ahead. No, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was you kind of Subin kind of hit that with
Hmm.
diversity of thought, and
Yeah.
I'm a strong proponent of that. Maybe it's because of the line of work that I do,
Uh-huh.
and 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 that's something that I value when I'm working as well. Like,
Hmm.
so diversity of thought is much more valuable to me than diversity of the ethnic background.
Hmm.
Because I mean, but regardless of that, we're gonna have diversity at work,
Hmm.
from the ethnic background, and that's something that I'm very comfortable with. And a lot of the companies where I work at, a lot of these companies are starting to include diversity from
Hmm.
like religious aspect,
Yeah.
like celebrating Diwali, because we all have like this huge population of like Indian workers at our workplace, right, in corporate America. So
Hmm.
like the companies are starting to celebrate Diwali.
Yeah.
uh, Us being from Nepal, we can kind of associate with them. So
Uh-huh.
it has started to include, but definitely, I would love to see like more like
Hmm.
festivals, like Nepalese festivals being celebrated at the workplace, because that will bring that sense of belonging,
Yep.
from the Nepalese roots or the Nepalese heritage, standpoint. But definitely, like I'm strong proponent of diversity of thoughts,
Hmm.
uh, more so than diversity. But I think the diversity of thoughts and diversity kind of goes hand in hand
Yeah.
from my perspective and what I've seen, in my career.
Yeah.
I will again venture out slightly differently on this. So, diversity of thought, obviously, I agree. But so two things over here. One, representation, right? So representation
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
slightly different than diversity, right?
Yeah.
So I do believe
Yeah,
representation matters, and the reason
yeah.
representation matters is more for future generations, right? we talk
Mhm.
about this. If you know, I answer questions on Reddit, our Nepal subreddit, and they'll ask me questions like, "Oh, you're in America." If people see a successful Nepali person in the United States, then other Nepali people are gonna be more
Mhm.
inspired, and not by me
Yeah.
necessarily. I might not say the right things,
Mhm.
but if you see your kind of people, whether that
Yeah.
be from an ethnic background perspective or gender perspective, then
Mhm.
it's more likely then we're gonna get that diversity. So I do believe in representation. Um, I do believe that we should have different kinds of faces. Let's say,
Uh-huh.
that being said, not it shouldn't be forced. I believe it shouldn't be
Yeah.
forced. It should still be based on merit, but
Mhm.
there has to be a pathway to allow people of different ethnic backgrounds, different different backgrounds to have
Mhm.
merit. So the
Yep.
work begins before the interview. The work
Yep.
begins
Mhm.
in communities. The work
Yep.
begins
Hmm.
at the government level.
Yeah.
There. So that's one. So I do believe representation matters for the future. And then in terms of the holidays and stuff, this is a complicated topic because America and maybe United Kingdom and maybe a few other countries are one of those few countries where there is so much influx of different kind of cultures.
Mhm.
If you go to Japan, nobody talks about
Hmm.
different kind of holidays because
Yep.
Yeah.
there's only one kind of people. Obviously
Uh-huh.
there's diversity within the Japanese culture, but people don't complain about having a Diwali holiday or a
Mhm.
Jewish holiday in Japan or China or even the closest other country that I know to United States is probably India because of the different kinds of subculture. There's multiple
Mhm.
religions, so
Yeah.
it is a concept that is new to humanity.
Mhm.
After borders were created, people
Mhm.
started being more and more alike. People started establishing themselves and settling in the same geographical location. Then more people started looking like the same and things like that. So this is a new concept, right?
Mhm.
So we're still figuring out how to we as in we in America, we're still trying to figure out
Yep.
how to allow people to celebrate their religious
Yep.
or other kinds of holidays. I personally believe what we should do is to have more floating holidays, as we call it, right? um,
Yep.
Hmm.
to have
Mhm.
5, 10 extra floating holidays that people can
Yep.
take vacations whenever they want. And then
Yep.
tying it back to empathy and acceptance, if my coworkers understand that I'm Hindu or Muslim or Jewish, and
Mhm.
I get to celebrate my own holiday and taking one floating or two floating holidays out of the year to celebrate my own ethnic holiday, more than likely most people are going to be fine with that because they're going to get their
Yep.
own floating holidays as well. So I think that's
Yep.
a concept that should be explored more. But yeah, I think representation matters. Giving people floating holidays that matter, but it is definitely a new concept that we're still learning and still working our way into.
Yeah, I think you nicely put that, right? Like you tied it back to the representation. And I think the more we have that representation, I think this conversation would grow further, right? And I think we are coming into certain positions within our field where we could amplify those voices, right? And
Yeah,
I think that is important as
yeah.
well. Uh,
Sorry, I almost forgot to mention that exact point is amplifying that voice. As I mentioned, if you see another person of your kind, then you're going to be inspired to succeed. And for that reason
mhm.
alone, I think representation is
Yeah.
important.
No, I think it's important to have that conversation and continue to have that conversation. I think, we all have different backgrounds, we all bring in different perspective, and I think we should continue on this conversation. And I think as we continue this conversation, because of representation, I think we'll get to a place where, we all have a voice. Just to wrap things up, right? Because we've been discussing about work culture. One thing I wanted to leave our listeners and viewers with something from you all is that if you could travel back in time, right, and we were to offer a piece of advice to yourself, a younger self, right, what would be the valuable insight, right, that you would give? It could be in terms of, what we have discussed so far, or something you would do differently, right? Any thoughts on that?
I don't have an immediate answer. I'm going to flip that around on either of you first, or maybe even Umit,
All right.
because you've been asking a lot of
Yeah.
questions. So maybe,
Yeah.
you should answer that question yourself as well.
I think I'm going to bring in sociology a little bit because I've not talked about that at all in this podcast, right? Uh, I would explore what we call in our network analysis. There's this thing called strength of weak ties, and what that means is you should immediately look outside of your circle for new resources, right? And this could be your job opportunity, could be a new relationship or something like that, right? So let's say if I were to engage just with Manish and Subin and myself and Utsav, right, who has been on our previous podcast, we all engage in the same network. We all have same ideas, and we kind of tend to replicate each other's thoughts and processes, right? So if I was, for example, looking for a job, and if I come to you guys and say, "Hey guys, like, are you looking for like I'm looking for a job. Like, do you guys have any opportunities within
Mhm.
your organization?" Like everybody knows everybody, so that information gets old pretty quickly, right? If I were to reach out anybody outside of my contact, of my network, immediate network, with whom I don't often communicate as much as I do with you guys, then that person would bring in new information, right? So that's what we call in sociology the strength of weak ties is that person you don't communicate with most often tends to have more or valuable resources for you, right? So that's where I would kind of guide myself, right? If I was to my younger self and say, hey, like, if I was looking for jobs, like I would seek out outside of my network to folks that I seldom talk and use those resources more because I feel like I limit myself with my own immediate group of people. So that would be one advice that I can think it would be applicable. But yeah.
Manish, go ahead.
For me, it's based on like how my career has gone so far, and if I were to see to my younger self starting my career, and for me it would be like focus more on programming and
Hmm.
focus more on like stats, because I mean that's the line of the data science and data engineering, and almost computer science is all almost the same. It's kind of evolved into one, because these days you need data engineering, data science in all fields of work, whether it's physics, chemistry, anything, right? So it's
Hmm.
kind of, so I mean that might be the one. I mean, focus more on studies. I don't know, because that might be one. But I mean, from the other aspects of like building communications and connections at the workplace, I think I've been pretty successful, so far. That
Hmm.
building that personal rapport or relationship. But I think at this point, that's something that I wish I could improve on. Uh,
I
Subin?
honestly don't have a good answer for that. I hate these kind of questions for
Yeah.
two or three reasons. Like one, I believe in the butterfly effect too much. Like
Hmm.
if I had
Yeah.
done something differently in the past, then I wouldn't be where I'm today, and I'm quite happy with where I'm today. So if I gave myself an advice and did something, and even if I was more successful, maybe I wouldn't have been as happy. That's, I know it's not answering your question, but if I had to force myself to answer that question, then I think about this a lot. I'm a person who regrets. No, regrets is probably another word, but whatever I do, I feel guilty that I didn't do more of.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think it might be an Asian thing as well, or Nepali thing. I don't know, but definitely with me, I've always wished I did more. Whatever it was, whether I
Yeah.
was exercising, I wish I exercised more. If I was, programming, I wish I programmed more. And so obviously, I
Yeah.
can't go back to myself and say, hey, program more, because if I did that,
Yeah.
then I would be in the present time and I would say, hey, program more. And every single time it would just be more of that. But the one thing I always think about is I just wish I had caught on to I did kind of catch on to, but I didn't do anything about it. But it caught on to the early days of the iPhone app development and
Uh,
develop
Yeah.
something that got big, and I wouldn't have to be working right now, right? But that's but another butterfly effect that I don't want to get into.
I, I thought you were gonna say Bitcoin. I was like,
Bitcoin. Yeah,
yeah, I was like,
that's the first thing that came to
right.
my
I was
mind.
like,
Yeah.
I think that's where Subin is going. Like, if I could tell my younger self to go buy loads of Bitcoin.
Well,
Um,
if we had hindsight, then
okay, so I think that's a good point for us to stop, right, and to ponder what if Subin had bought $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, he would
I
have
wouldn't
been
be doing
rich
this
and
podcast
miserable.
for sure.
He wouldn't be doing this podcast at all. So I want to thank you, both of you for engaging in this wonderful conversation. I think this is a conversation that needs to happen. We need to continue this, discussion around workplace, not just about the representation and diversity and inclusivity, but also, how do we get to be more seen, more valued at work, and how do we excel at work? So thank you to you too again. And for our viewers or listeners, please let us know how we did in this podcast. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you again sometimes in the future, in about 2 weeks.
Thank you guys, and thank you, Umid, for putting all the hard
Thank
work
you.
on this, and
All right.
hopefully we keep getting better. So thank you guys.
Yeah,
Bye
thank you.
bye.